Hi everybody, my name is Melanie Nunez, and today I'll be presenting on Herman Melville's poem, The Portent. So first I thought I'd go over the definition of portent. Oxford English Dictionary defines it as a sign, indication, or omen of a momentous or calamitous event which is about to happen. In the context of Melville's poem, Brown is essentially the portent of the imminent Civil War, which we know takes place a few years after his execution. And Melville also transforms John Brown and his execution from something physical into something that holds much more spiritual weight or symbolism. So he essentially transforms Brown into a prophet who is carrying out a predetermined fate rather than acting out of his own convictions. I also want to touch on a few moments from the poem that were striking. The first being, and the stab shall heal no more. This is essentially saying that the Harper's Ferry raid won't be an isolated event, and the slaveholding South will not have time to heal because the violence will continue. And this is, of course, alluding to the Civil War. In the next line, hidden in the cap is the anguish none can draw. Here the cap represents Brown's inner world, his mind, and Melville is suggesting that even though we have extensive historical accounts, we cannot with 100% certainty determine what Brown's motivations and thoughts were while he was carrying out these acts of violence. In the next line, so your future veils its face. Brown is presented as the future, and the future, of course, is the Civil War. And by describing him as having his face veiled, to me that suggests that people knew something was coming, but what shape it would actually take was still obscured. And in the last line of the poem, John Brown is referred to as the meteor of the war. And I believe Brown is described in this way because he was sort of that initial destructive blow that would eventually lead to much more bloodshed during the war. As I've mentioned before, throughout his poem, Melville paints Brown to be an almost supernatural prophet, and here I just included a few lines that show Melville essentially dehumanizing Brown in order to transform him from an ordinary human into something supernatural or a spiritual force. In the first line, gaunt the shadow being John Brown's shadow as he's being hung, hidden in the cap rather than his mind. Your future veils its face rather than his face. The streaming beard rather than his streaming beard. I just believe these word choices were very intentional, and they helped create this image of Brown as something beyond human. Something I noticed while reading is that there seems to be a shift in narrator in the lines that are in parentheses. And here I just pointed out two examples from the poem that show how Melville's writing shifts in these lines. The first being Lo John Brown, which is very archaic and reminiscent of biblical diction. Also, Weird John Brown, which in my research I learned that weird is actually derived from an Old English word meaning fate or destiny, which I feel is very fitting in the context of John Brown. So these lines essentially serve as a second narrator, and the parentheses make these lines kind of read as a whisper or an echo, and I feel that this really adds to the poem's underlying sense of impending doom and conflict that is inevitable. So one last thing, in my research, I learned that in Norse mythology, the Norns are these goddesses that control fate, or weird as they refer to it, and this belief suggests that events cannot be controlled. I know that Melville has made allusions to Norse mythology in other works like Moby Dick, So I do think it's entirely possible that this connection was intentional. Because this would mean Melville was comparing Brown to these goddesses of fate, basically saying that his motivations for the Harper's Ferry raid went beyond his own decisions and were actually a force of fate itself. So Melville is essentially saying that Brown's raid was not random, but something that had already been set in stone to bring about the Civil War. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for watching.